All right, in this video, we're going to review the digestive system. So we're going to go through this PowerPoint really quickly, just hitting the high notes. What are the important things that you need to know about the digestive system? First, digestion happens in four parts. Digestion, taking in food. Digestions, of which there are two. There's a mechanical digestion, where you break down the food into smaller pieces. And then there's chemical digestion, which is where you actually break down the food chemically into like its constituent parts. So essentially, if you're grinding the food or chewing the food, that's mechanical digestion. That happens in the mouth and in the stomach. The stomach is largely responsible for finishing up mechanical digestion. That's why it churns, the muscles move the food about, and it has the acid which dissolves the food and breaks it down, but doesn't actually chemically break it down. Enzymes complete chemical digestion, which is why it says enzymatic hydrolysis, where you're actually breaking the pieces of the food apart. So like that's the sugars that make up the starch, you're breaking down into sugars, or the amino acids that make up the protein. You're breaking that protein down into its individual amino acids, and that requires an enzyme. Most of that happens in the small intestines. Lipids only get broken down in the small intestines. Proteins actually start being broken down in the stomach, and the mouth, in your saliva, actually begins to break down starches and some of the carbohydrates. That's when we did that cracker experiment with Mr. Gergen. Then there's absorption, which is where the small molecules actually get absorbed into the body. That happens in the small intestine. Those are the nutrients being absorbed. And then elimination, that's getting rid of the undigested stuff, the food that we can't break down. That's actually what poop is. It is not waste that our cells have created. That's leftover food that we couldn't digest. So that's elimination. So ingestion, the two digestions, absorption, and elimination. There are multiple kinds of ingestion: substrate feeding, suspension feeding, bulk feeding, and fluid feeding. It all just depends on what you eat and how often you eat it, essentially. Bulk feeding means you're filling up your stomach at one time and then you're going for a while without food. Fluid feeding means you're literally just eating fluids. Suspension feeding is filter feeding. And substrate feeding is eating the stuff that you live on, which is what this caterpillar is doing here in this leaf. You don't have to worry about this. Just know that we have a digestive cavity, and that most animals that we're talking about have alimentary canals. That is, they have two openings and the food flows one way through the body. If you remember from the article, they said that the digestive system is actually kind of outside of our body, right? We don't think of it that way, but like essentially we have a tunnel going through our body from our mouth to our anus. And the inside the lumen of that space is technically external to our body. It's technically in that tunnel space that's not actually inside of our body. Don't worry about protostomes or protostomes. That's not important. This gives you an indication of diversity of digestive systems. It's not a huge, I wouldn't spend a huge amount of time on this slide. Here you have all the organs of the digestive system. Now, what's important to realize is that some are what we call accessory organs, meaning the food does not pass through them, and some are actually part of the digestive system in which the food moves through. So if you see here the mouth, the esophagus, the esophagus, the stomach, small intestine, large intestine, rectum, anus, that's essentially your alimentary canal. Now, it's a lot more convoluted than that because we have adaptations that increase surface area so that we can get more nutrients from our food. So if you see here, the small intestines, like we saw in our pig, are actually like a lot of them all tangled together in the middle there. And our large intestine runs around our body, unlike in the pig where it was like curled up over in the corner. Now, we also have some accessory organs: the liver, the gallbladder, the pancreas, and our salivary glands. Those are involved in digestion. They secrete things that help with digestion. But the food doesn't actually move through them. So the liver creates bile, which is stored in the gallbladder, which then is secreted into the small intestines. Those help to break down fat. The pancreas secretes insulin, which regulates blood sugar, but also it secretes bicarbonate, which is put into our duodenum, our small intestine, the very beginning part, where it helps to break down foods, but it also, more importantly, neutralizes the stomach acid so that our small intestine doesn't get acid burns from the incredibly acidic gastric juices. We also have these sphincters. They control food passage, so they relax and open up and allow food to pass through in what we call boluses, sort of small measured amounts. And then, of course, our salivary glands make saliva, which lubricates the food, makes it easier to move through peristalsis, and also begins to break down starches. So those are accessory organs and like the main organs of the digestive system. Now, our respiratory system and our digestive system hook up in our throat in what's called the pharynx, which is our sort of throat area. And we have organ called the epiglottis, whose job it is to sort of block one or the other. We don't want to swallow air and we don't want to inhale food. So the epiglottis is normally up. That allows us to breathe air through the larynx, which is our voice box, and down into the trachea. And like we saw in the pig, behind the trachea is the esophagus, which is the smoother, not rigid, because the trachea has like cartilaginous rings that keep it open so that we can constantly breathe air, even if we're like laying down. It doesn't get crushed, but the esophagus is smoother because it doesn't have to operate all the time. So it doesn't have those cartilaginous rings. And so normally the epiglottis is up, the esophageal sphincter is closed, so we're breathing in and that air is going down the trachea. But when we go to swallow, when we push our tongue up against the roof of our mouth and make that swallowing motion, that pushes the epiglottis down, which blocks off the trachea and allows food to move through the esophagus, opening up that esophageal sphincter. And then when we're done swallowing, the epiglottis goes back up and we can breathe again. When you choke, when you move food down your trachea, that's essentially what choking is when you get food stuck here in the tracheal opening, then this system has messed up. So like if you've ever taken a drink of water and it's gone down the wrong pipe, you cough to remove that from your trachea. From the trachea, it's going to go into the stomach. Like we said, the stomach is in charge of more mechanical digestion. It's going to break down the food by contracting and churning and pushing that food around. It also has acid, which is going to start dissolving the food and killing any bacteria that's in our food. So that's an important protection for us. And we can store food in our stomach for bulk feeders so that we don't, all the food doesn't move through our digestive system at once. From there, we go to the small intestine. That's where most chemical digestion happens. And absorption is going to happen here. So the liver gives us bile, which helps to digest fat. The pancreas helps to neutralize the stomach acid. And most of the digestion happens in the first 25 centimeters, which is the duodenum or the duodenum. That's where most chemical digestion happens. And then in the rest of the 22 feet of small intestines that humans have is absorption. And here we have a few adaptations to increase surface area. So like we saw, the capillaries increase surface area so that we can have more gas exchange, and the alveoli and the lungs increase surface area, again, so we can have more gas exchange. These small intestines are going to have adaptations to increase surface area. First, they're really long and all jumbled up, so that gives us more surface area, but also the inner lining of the small intestine is very folded, and those folds are folded. They have villi and then microvilli. So this is a villi right here, and then on top of those are microvilli that actually increase the surface area hugely, which allows us to absorb all of the nutrients from our food. It makes us efficient digesters. Now, what we saw in the dissection is that there's this mesentery tissue that holds the small intestine together, and that provides us with these blood vessels and lymph vessels that allow for us to actually absorb nutrients. So the amino acids and sugars are going to be absorbed into our blood, and the fatty acids and fats are going to go into the lymph because the blood is mostly water, and fats don't dissolve well in water. So they're going to travel in the lymph, and the amino acids and sugars, so from proteins and carbohydrates, are going to go into the blood. And that absorption is happening all along the length of our small intestine. Here's how the blood sort of circulates here so that you can see how the cardiovascular system interplays with the digestive system. The blood is going to come through, go to the intestines, both large and small, pick up nutrients from the small intestines. The large intestine's job is mostly to absorb water and to continue some breakdown. There's bacteria in our large intestines that converts important nutrients into vitamins and stuff that we can't make ourselves, but those bacteria do. So the large intestine is home to lots of important bacteria. All that blood is going to go to the liver to be filtered for toxins, so we make sure that nothing that we ate gets into our bloodstream in a large scale. We're going to get it out with our liver, and then it's going to go to the heart to be pumped out through the rest of the body, including the kidneys, where we will filter out wastes. From the small intestine, the food's going to go into the large intestine. Here's the appendix there, as you see here, and the cecum. Humans don't have a very large cecum because we eat mostly non-plants. We don't break down cellulose. In herbivores who need to break down cellulose for their nutrients, they have large cecums, which house even more bacteria that allow for the breakdown of cellulose, because humans can't digest cellulose. Bacteria can, though. The appendix is largely vestigial, although we have recently discovered that there is a role that it plays for us in that it it's like a safe house for bacteria. If we get a really bad infection throughout our intestines, a lot of times what happens is that kills off our good bacteria, and that's what causes diarrhea and stuff. Well, the appendix is like a little safe house, like the annex where Anne Frank lived. It's like this little place off to the side that the infection won't get to, and so once we get over the infection, then we can repopulate our colon from the bacteria that live in the appendix. So it does serve a purpose. You can just live without it. You don't have to have one to survive. And so as the food moves through here, the bacteria help us to digest some of the food, help create some things that we need, but we also mostly reabsorb water from the waste material, from the stuff that we can't digest. And so the material in the large intestine gets harder and harder and harder. It gets drier and drier as it moves through the large intestine until it reaches the rectum, where it's stored until it's time to expel that waste or eliminate that waste through the anus. Again, this is just a picture that compares carnivores and herbivores, and you can see that the size of the large intestine is much bigger because the large, particularly that cecum, but also the need for bacteria to help digest that plant matter is much bigger in herbivores than it is in carnivores. So we have very different digestive systems. It's a form matching function sort of situation, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is the digestive system in a nutshell. So happy studying.